Alberta Primetime with Michael Higgins.
Welcome to Alberta Primetime. Ahead tonight, our politics panel on expectations rolling into the spring sitting. But first, navigating trade turmoil.
Make no mistake about it, President Trump still has a lot of tools, but I think it's the walls are closing in on President Trump.
Ontario's premier on the U.S. Supreme Court striking down many of the tariffs backstopping the Trump administration's trade agenda, a ruling that comes as the Prime Minister prepares to depart on a 9-day trip to India, Australia, and Japan. And joining us now, Gary Marr, President and CEO of the Canada West Foundation. He's a former MLA and cabinet minister, of course, a former representative for our province in Washington and in Asia. Mr. Marr, good to see you again, sir. Welcome back.
Great to see you. Thanks for having me on, Michael.
Okay, let's start quickly on that Supreme Court ruling on Trump tariffs. What stands out for you about that decision and the degree of impact it may or may not have?
Well, let me start by saying to talk about what Premier Ford talked about, and that's that there's many tools that the president has at his disposal to levy tariffs or levies against goods coming into the United States. So the one that was before the Supreme Court of the United States last week was IEEPA, the International Emergency Economic Powers Act. And people will recall that the president used the pretext of fentanyl coming into the United States as a reason for invoking the IEEPA tariffs that were set at 35%. But I think it's notable that almost 90% of Canadian goods are exempt from IEEPA, and that includes Western Canada. So the fact that IEEPA has now been extinguished by a 6-3 vote of the Supreme Court, notably 3 of the President Trump's appointees voted against him on this. But I think it's notable that it won't have that big an impact on Western Canada. The second piece of legislation is Section 232 of the U.S. Trade Act. That's the one where the president is putting tariffs on steel, aluminum, lumber, which of course does affect Alberta and Western Canada, and auto parts. That legislation remains in place. And then the third piece of legislation is the Trade Act of 1974. And after the president lost the IEEPA decision at the Supreme Court of the United States, he then invoked the Trade Act of 1974 to place a global tariff. First, he said on the Friday night at 10%. Saturday morning, he said 15%. And those are to cover the goods that are no longer going to be subject to tariffs under IEEPA. So for Canada, I think it means that there's really a couple of things that they need to focus on. One is how important CUSMA is, the Canada-U.S. Free Trade Agreement, Canada-U.S.-Mexico Free Trade Agreement. And also the second focus has to be on trying to mitigate or bring down the tariffs that come under these other pieces of legislation like Section 232 that is affecting lumber, steel, and aluminum and auto parts.
Okay, so as that hangs over the heads of Canadians, if we shift now then to diversifying trade partnerships, there was a large government and industry delegation spending much of last week in Mexico. What kind of path does that pave with CUSMA renegotiations still on the horizon?
Well, you know, going back to what the Prime Minister did in his trip to China, I think was important. I think he went into China with a twofold objective. One was to increase the opportunities, the economic opportunities for exports to China, and two, make sure that you don't do anything that's going to impair your national security apparatus and your values here in Canada. I think if that's the basis on which he's going, he was successful on both of those points in going to China. He'll now try and do the same thing in Mexico and then later in India, Australia. And these things take a long time. I mean, it's difficult to break away from the United States. It will be impossible, in fact, ultimately, because geography is such an important part of who you do trade with. And so it's a tight wire that the Prime Minister is walking to make sure that while at the same time we're trying to maintain our good relationship under CUSMA with the United States. We do want to increase our trade with other jurisdictions. I think that's a good thing. But it won't be easy, because ultimately it's not governments that do trade, it's businesses that do trade. The individual decisions of thousands or tens of thousands of individual businesses, where they're going to do business with, is a decision by businesses, not by governments. Now, governments can help make it easier by ensuring that, for example, our trade infrastructure is in place, so that we can get our goods from where they are to where they need to be. And trade infrastructure, our ports, our railways, our roads, our bridges, our airports, and of course our pipelines are all important trade infrastructure, because if you can't move it, you can't sell it. And that's something that is going to require a lot of domestic effort to get that trade infrastructure, so that you can actually breathe life into the opportunities that businesses may have to trade with who they want to trade with.
Okay, and on that point of opportunities, the first stop in this three-nation tour that the PM is about to embark on is Mumbai. That'll include talks with Prime Minister Narendra Modi. And it was just a few weeks ago, Gary, the Alberta government sent a minister and an MLA to India. In terms of missions, how likely is one to piggyback or build off of the other?
I think it's got to be an all-out effort by all of them. So, for example, I think in going to China, I think Premier Mo should take a bow for the work that he did in China. That was the lead-up to the deal that was signed off between Canada and China. I give a lot of credit to Premier Mo. I give credit to to Premier Smith for sending a mission to India in advance of the Canadian mission. So I think that it's all hands on deck. We need national governments, subnational governments, chambers of commerce. We need businesses, business associations, all working collaboratively to build the kind of connectivity that we need to these markets that are abroad. I should say this too, that new Canadians that have come to this country, they could be an important asset as we try to establish relationships from the countries that those people came from. So I think that these new Canadians can be an asset if we're paying attention.
All right. We'll have to leave it there for time, Mr. Mark. As always, appreciate your time. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Michael.
Gary Mark, President and CEO of the Canada West Foundation. From rolling into the next sitting of the legislature to the Alberta government pumping added dollars into doctor recruitment and retention, and an Alberta MP gets added to the Prime Minister's latest international trade trip. Time now for tonight's politics panel. And joining us this evening, Jim Groom, political scientist, recently retired from Medicine Hat College, and Graham Thompson is a longtime political columnist in the province. Good evening to you both. And let's begin with government messaging ahead of today's start of the spring sitting.
What I have heard in my role is that there are two main ways to drive away investment. The first way to drive away investment is to elect an NDP government. The second way to drive away investment is to bog down businesses in massive amounts of red tape and regulatory burdens, which is exactly what happened when Alberta did the former by electing an NDP government.
The government House leader there on announcing creation of a projects delivery office, part of the UCP's plan for legislation and priorities to come in this session ahead. Jim, what do you make of the messaging that accompanied highlighting of legislation to expect in this sitting? Surprised to see the degree of attention being paid to the opposition?
Well, yeah, it used to be that the House leader of the House was sort of diplomatic, I guess you could say, but it's obviously been thrown out the window here. I mean, he just mentioned the NDP a number of times in his 15 or 20-minute speech that he gave, and it was very derogatory, of course, and got quite personal at times with when he was answering some of the questions from the media and a few things. And I was a little surprised at that. I mean, We know that partisan politics is a big thing now, but it used to be a standard that was maintained by House leaders that was kind of over and above, because the House leader really has to coordinate with the other parties in order to let things go smoothly through the legislature. But that doesn't seem to be a priority here anymore.
Graham, you listened in as well on the government House Leaders News Conference this morning. What stands out for you where priorities or new legislation concern?
Yeah, well, I agree with Jim. The fact that they mentioned the opposition, like Peter Lougheed back in the day, just ignored the opposition. Of course, it's a bigger opposition today. It's the largest opposition in Alberta history. But some of the things they're talking about in this session going forward, reducing more interprovincial trade. So in other words, encouraging interprovincial trade, removing the barriers to that. That's something they've been talking about now for all of last year. The federal government's done its part to reduce the trade barriers, and the provinces are trying to do their part. It sounds easy. Let's just remove all the trade barriers across the country. But there's a lot of stuff going on behind the scenes in terms of, for example, alcohol. The provinces will never actually give free trade between provinces to alcohol at a commercial level, because the provinces all make a lot of money off that. They're also talking about a project delivery office, and that's a way for the province to bring in legislation to set up a system to fast-track major projects, which is fine. The province can do that within its own borders as long as it doesn't interfere with joint jurisdiction over things like the environment. So yeah, so they're trying to say we're open for business. We'll pass these laws to get legislation and to try and fast-track these things. More control over immigration. That's a really interesting one because, of course, the Premier last week in her speech talking about a referendum, 5 questions dealing with potentially limiting social government services to certain kinds of immigrants. What the government's talking about now in terms of legislation during the session is to get rid of bad actors, as they put it, people who are, who recruit people overseas and bring them to Canada. There's some bad actors, and they're trying to stop people from exploiting immigrants. But that's a common theme now with the Alberta government, immigration. There's also, they're boosting the Alberta Sheriff's police service. That's going to be given more, they'll be passing laws on that as well. That's basically one more step to us getting our own provincial police force, even though most Albertans do not want it. And so there's a lot of things going on with the government. One thing they're not talking about is separation. Of course, that's going on right now, and that's not an issue they're talking about. They won't be discussing that. NDP will bring it up during question period, no doubt, but the government doesn't want to deal with that on an official capacity.
Okay, well, and Jim, to pick up there on Graham's last point, the sitting is in the sessional calendar through the end of May. That's just after the deadline for the close of the contentious petition on separation. How do you see those two elements lining up?
Well, I think the government would like to delay it as much as possible, as Graham says. You know, they don't want to talk about these issues. In fact, the referendums, the 9 referendums that they're putting forward, is a distraction as far as I can see. The government has said, well, we don't want to talk about healthcare. We don't want to talk about the problems with education. We don't want to talk about the actual things that are impacting people. So let's do a distractive measure here, and we'll have these 9 referendums that people can focus in on and debate forever and ever. And you know that the NDP has been a little bit reserved on their response to this because I think they see it as a distraction. And the NDP's last communications was about healthcare and the crisis and needing to have a debate. I think that's probably the best approach, is to avoid that. But the NDP will definitely bring up the other referendum, and that is the independence movement. And they just they can run with that because they do know that at least 70% of the population doesn't want to leave Canada.
All right. Well, now ahead of the legislature reconvening, the Premier announced what the government is calling a record-breaking investment in doctors.
I think we got to a really good place in our negotiations with nurse practitioners and family doctors, but now we have to work through all of the different specialties. And part of that is going to be looking at where we are relative to the number of specialists in other large provinces, and whether there are some that we need to do more attraction for and others where we're doing just fine.
As part of the budget, the government plans to pump an extra $1.4 billion into physician recruitment, training, and compensation. That's 22% more than budget 2025. For months, doctors have said the system is in crisis, plagued by overcrowding and long waits. Graham, what does the government accomplish in rolling out this particular announcement ahead of the start of the sitting and, of course, ahead of Thursday's budget?
Well, it's a way of showing Albertans, listen, we are taking healthcare issues seriously. We're giving more money to doctors, $1.4 billion more in this budget, so they're boosting it tremendously. The problem is this really new money? Is this actually something going to boost this system? Because you got questions from the Alberta Medical Association, which is, I'm going to call it the doctors' union, for lack of a better term. They weren't notified about this. They weren't consulted. The government just did this without talking to the AMA. And there's questions now from the AMA and others is this just the government getting ahead of these? They're into contract negotiations with the doctors. And so they'll be spending more money on doctors regardless because of this new contract coming up. So the question is this really new money? Is this something they're doing above and beyond what we think is going to be the contract outcome? So the question right now is that are they really spending more money than they would have to spend to give doctors a new contract, or is this something actually above and beyond that? And that's not clear.
Jim, the NDP heading into the start of the sitting today, renewing the call for an emergency debate on health care. How much wind do you see this big dollar announcement for doctors taking out of the sails of the opposition?
Well, it's only going to go so far, and I think the Angus Reid report that's indicated that Alberta and Ontario were the only two jurisdictions in Canada that still had fewer doctors than they did 10 years ago. So we can finally realize that we're bankrupt and the system is broken, but we're just doing patchwork at this point. And I think the fact that they're setting the table a little bit for the negotiations coming up in March with the doctors is to help grease the skids a little bit so that the doctors are feeling like something is being done, but it is, I would suggest too little too late.
All right. Time for us to take a bit of a break. But when we come back, Canadian efforts to carve out new trade partnerships. More from our politics panel in a moment. Welcome back. With the Prime Minister set to embark this week on a 9-day international trade trip to India, Australia, and Japan, it came word today an Alberta MP will join the government delegation. Former Edmonton Conservative MP Matt Genereux landed in headlines last week when he crossed the floor to the governing Liberals, that despite announcing in November that he would resign. Now, in joining the government benches, the Prime Minister said Genereux would take on the role of Special Advisor on Economic and Security Partnerships. So, Jim, let's maybe start quick there on Matt Genereux. Surprised to see a floor crosser being tapped so early for such a high-profile trade mission.
I don't want to be too skeptical here, of course, Michael, but I think it's pretty clear that the Prime Minister still wants to recruit some more Conservatives. He wants to attract some more folks across the floor so that they can join the Liberals and he can get a majority government. They have some by-elections coming up that are going to impact on that, but he'd like to recruit a few more folks. But so showing that there's a room here for you, that there's a voice to be had, couldn't it be better than to take the brand new member on a world tour with you to actually demonstrate his, well, he is a competent member, but also to demonstrate his impact, that he is going to have a voice in the Liberal Party.
Graham, you're in agreement with that? This is some kind of maybe a signal to other Conservative caucus members who might be entertaining an idea of going to the Liberals.
Yeah, it could be a way of saying, look, if you cross the floor, you will be an important member of the Liberal caucus. But it's also something for Matt Genereux. If he wants to run for election again, for re-election, he has to show, look, I got something. He wasn't just crossing the floor to be a backbencher. He has to tell people in his own riding that, hey, I'm actually part of the Liberal team. And that's really important because I look back to Anne McClellan. Anne McClellan was, of course, Deputy Prime Minister. Like, she was a Liberal, elected in 1993 by 12 votes only, and she managed to get reelected because she was such an important part of a Liberal majority government. The minute it seemed that Harper, of course, in 2006 was going to win the election, she lost that election. So Albertans will take on a Liberal if the Liberal is seen to be part of an important voice in a majority government. So we'll see what happens next election if Matt Joyner wants to win. So you had to get something, some sort of high-profile thing. They couldn't just give him, of course, a cabinet post. That'd be unseemly. They can give him something like this, and they can work his way up. And we'll see what actually happens the next step for him if they attract more people from the Conservatives, but also what rewards do they give them, and what reward do they give Matt Joyner in particular, because, of course, he's from Alberta.
Jim, now, we heard from the Canada West Foundation's Gary Marr off the top. What do you see hinging on this particular trade junket to India, Australia, and Japan? Should Canadians expect the PM and this entourage to deliver?
Yes, and if they don't deliver, of course, then Carney is going to take it on the chin a little bit there. But, Trump, with his 19th century tariffs, has driven everybody away from the Americans and forced them to go to other markets, which maybe is the best thing for Canada, to find other markets. Even though we still have 75% of our trade with the Americans, we do have to diversify. We do have to find other areas. One of the things that does take it on the chin a little bit here, too, though, is our concern for human rights. We put the economic aspect first and our human rights second at this stage, and it makes it a little bit uncomfortable for Canadians, because we like to think that we do have a higher standard when it comes to the human rights considerations.
Graham, where the Indian leg of the trip is concerned, the premiers of Saskatchewan and New Brunswick taking part. Scott Moe, again, on another delegation. Surprised not to see anyone from the Smith government being named?
Well, I don't think they want to give a lot of support to the Liberals, within reason, that they're very much tied to the idea of the MOU for the pipeline. But I think that when it comes to these trade missions, what will they achieve? And a lot of stuff goes on behind the scenes in terms of getting something together. It's not just a case that they show up like unannounced, hey, let's get a deal or something. They will be working behind the scenes even before this trade mission goes ahead. And they're careful, of course, never to overestimate any sort of success. But if they get anything out of this, it's something that's been spending weeks working towards. And you're right, Jim's right, you just can't come back with nothing. You have to have something, and not just an MOU. You need something concrete. So I think they're going there with the understanding probably they have some sort of deal already almost worked out. They just need to sign it. It's an issue, though, when it comes to, of course, Jim mentioned human rights when it comes to India. But hey, listen, we've got a trade deal with China. And we've been forced to look for other partners other than the U.S. because of Donald Trump.
Yeah, Jim, the last 30 seconds to you. How much did you see that U.S. Supreme Court ruling on Trump tariffs factoring into any or all of the discussions on this trade trip?
Well, as Gary pointed out, it's very convoluted, and try to navigate all the changes that are going on and what tweeting messages will come out in the middle of the night. And of course, the State of the Union address is tonight with the president, and we could be completely changing our tune here, and there could be all kinds of ramifications from his next imposition of different tariffs or a different approach, or you just never know. It's just not consistent. It's not stable, and Americans are suffering as much as the rest of the world is from it. In fact.
Yeah, and expecting that the Trump address tonight will certainly give us some fodder for discussions on the panel tomorrow. Gentlemen, we have to leave it there. Great to see you both. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thanks, Michael. Thank you.
That is our program for this evening. Remember, you can always have your say. Email us anytime at comments@albertaprimetime.com. Coming up tomorrow, with the Premier setting the stage for an October referendum on limiting benefits to non-permanent residents, we will hear from immigration lawyer Raj Sharma. That's on Wednesday. Until then, have a great evening, everyone. From all of us at Alberta Primetime, thank you for watching, and join us again next time.